From a young age, he always felt a sense of responsibility toward the people around him. He was never one to shy away from helping others, no matter how small or large the task was. Whether it was assisting a neighbor with groceries or offering a listening ear to a friend in need, he felt a deep satisfaction in making the lives of others just a little easier. The idea of fixing what was broken, of providing solutions to people's problems, became a part of who he was. In school, while other kids were focused on their own activities, he found himself drawn to those who struggled. When someone was struggling with their homework, he was the first to offer help. When someone felt left out, he would make them feel included. It wasn't that he wanted praise for his actions. It was just that helping people made him feel like he had purpose, that he mattered. His peers came to rely on him, seeing him as someone who could always be counted on. As he got older, his natural inclination to help grew stronger. He found himself in situations where people would turn to him for advice or assistance. His reputation as a dependable, compassionate person spread beyond his circle of friends and family. At work, colleagues would approach him when they faced difficulties, whether it was something work-related or something more personal. His ability to listen without judgment made him a trusted figure in the office, and he became the unofficial go-to person. Despite the satisfaction he gained from helping others, there were moments when he felt a deep, quiet sadness creeping in. He would look at the people around him, the ones whose lives he had impacted, and wonder if anyone ever truly saw him for who he was. It wasn't that he regretted helping others. It was that he had spent so much time focusing on their needs that he had forgotten about his own. He couldn't remember the last time someone had asked how he was doing. He couldn't recall the last time someone had simply listened to him without offering advice or solutions. And that was okay, he told himself. He was the helper. He didn't need help. He was content with the role he had chosen for himself. But over the years, something began to shift. He started to feel the weight of constantly being the one people turned to. He had always been proud of his ability to offer solutions, to ease the burdens of others, but now it felt like his own burdens were becoming too heavy to carry. He began to question if he had lost himself in the process. Was he really helping others? Or was he just avoiding dealing with his own pain by focusing on theirs? He didn't want to admit it, but the cracks in his perfect image were starting to show. There were nights when he couldn't sleep, his mind racing with thoughts of how much he had done for others, yet how little he had done for himself. He tried to push those thoughts aside, telling himself that as long as the people around him were happy, that was enough. But deep down, he knew that something was missing, something that couldn't be fixed with just one more act of kindness or one more selfless gesture. His partner had begun to notice the change in him as well. At first it was subtle. He would come home from work more exhausted than usual, his mind preoccupied with the troubles of others. But over time it became harder to ignore. The distance between them grew, and although they still shared moments of affection and love, it felt like something was missing. She often asked him if he was okay, but he would just shrug it off, assuring her that everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. He began to feel like a shell of the person he used to be. His energy, once boundless, was now depleted. He was no longer the cheerful, optimistic person who found joy in helping others. He was tired, physically, mentally, and emotionally. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't turn off the part of him that needed to fix things. It was ingrained in him, a part of who he was. He didn't know how to let go, how to say no, how to take a step back and care for himself. And so he continued to give. He continued to fix. He continued to be the person everyone could rely on, even if it meant breaking inside. His desire to help others became both a strength and a weakness. It gave him purpose, but it also left him empty. He had spent so much time putting others' needs before his own that he no longer knew how to take care of himself. He would find solace in the small acts of kindness he performed. A smile from a stranger, a thank you from a colleague, a hug from a friend. These moments brought him comfort, but they were fleeting. They didn't fill the emptiness he felt inside. And yet he couldn't stop. He couldn't stop being the person who fixed others. It was who he was, and it was all he knew. In the back of his mind, he knew something had to change. But what? How could he keep helping others when he was falling apart inside? How could he keep going when he no longer had the strength to carry on? These questions haunted him, but he pushed them aside, telling himself that as long as he was making a difference in the lives of others, everything would be okay. But deep down, He wondered. What would happen if he stopped fixing everyone else and focused on himself for once? What would happen if he let go of the role he had played for so long and allowed himself to heal? The thought was both terrifying and liberating. But for now it remained just that, a thought. As the years passed, his sense of responsibility continued to grow. He didn't mind the late nights or the constant juggling of tasks. After all, he believed helping others was his true calling, something he was meant to do. But as time went on, the toll it took on him became undeniable. At first, it was small signs, moments when he felt more tired than usual, or when his patience would wear thin faster than it ever had before. He brushed them off, thinking they were temporary. But soon those small signs turned into something more. It was as if the weight of the world had slowly crept onto his shoulders, and it was getting harder and harder to carry. His work became more demanding, with colleagues and clients alike constantly relying on him. He was always the one to step in, always the one to offer a solution even when he wasn't sure he had one himself. The more he helped, the more people seemed to depend on him, and the more his sense of pride grew. He was needed, and that felt good. But at home, things were different. He loved his family deeply, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His partner, who had once been his closest confidant, had become someone he saw less and less. When he came home at night, the house was quiet, and he realized that the warmth he once felt in his relationship was beginning to fade. They still shared meals and casual conversations, but there was an underlying distance that he couldn't ignore. He would come home, tired from the day's work, and his partner would ask how his day went. He would always say it was fine. He never wanted to burden them with the stress of his job or the pressure he felt. His partner, always understanding, never pushed him, but he could sense the frustration growing in their eyes. They were not getting the version of him they once knew, the version who was present, engaged, and emotionally available. And yet, he still couldn't stop. Even as he felt himself unraveling, he continued to give, continued to fix. There was always someone who needed him, and he couldn't turn his back on them. It became a pattern: work, help, go home, help again. He became a person defined by the needs of others. In many ways, that's who he was, and it felt good to be needed. It gave him a sense of worth, a sense of purpose. But deep down, there were moments of doubt. What about his own needs? What about his own dreams and desires? Every time he tried to think about what he wanted for himself, his mind would quickly push those thoughts aside, overwhelmed by the constant stream of others' needs. It was almost as if he didn't deserve to think about himself, as if his role as a helper was more important than his own well-being. His physical health started to reflect the toll his emotional exhaustion had taken. He couldn't remember the last time he had truly rested. Even on weekends, when he had a few hours of free time, he would spend it helping someone or tackling yet another task on his to-do list. He had become so used to being the one who fixed things that he had forgotten what it was like to take a break and simply enjoy life. His body began to send him signals: frequent headaches, trouble sleeping, an overwhelming sense of fatigue. But even then, he pushed through. He told himself that this was just part of the job, that it was worth it to see others happy and relieved. But deep inside, he knew something wasn't right. He was tired. His spirit was tired. At work, things started to become more difficult. The projects that once excited him now felt like burdens. The tasks he once handled with ease became sources of stress. Every email, every phone call, every meeting seemed to drain him further. The pressure mounted, and he felt like he was running on empty. His colleagues, who once admired his ability to manage everything, began to notice the change. He wasn't as sharp as he used to be. His enthusiasm had faded. He found it harder to concentrate, and his once reliable memory started to falter. It was a reminder of just how far he had stretched himself. Too far, perhaps. He was no longer able to keep up the facade that everything was fine, but he didn't know how to admit it. He had always been the strong one, the one who helped, the one who never asked for an answer. Meanwhile, his personal life continued to deteriorate. His partner grew frustrated with his constant unavailability, both physically and emotionally. They would make plans for the evening, only for him to cancel last minute because someone else needed him. He would apologize, promise that it wouldn't happen again, but it always did. And with each broken promise, the distance between them grew. The person who once loved him, who had been his rock, was slowly beginning to feel like a stranger. One evening, his partner sat him down. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't angry or accusatory, but there was a quiet sadness in their voice. They asked him, "When was the last time you really listened to me? When was the last time you looked at me and saw me, not just someone who needed you?" The question hit him hard. He couldn't answer. He realized that in all his efforts to fix everyone else, he had stopped fixing the one relationship that mattered most. The one person who had been there for him all these years was now feeling neglected, just like everyone else. His partner didn't blame him. They understood his need to help, but they also needed him. They needed him to be present, not just physically but emotionally. And in that moment it became painfully clear to him. He had been giving so much to others that he had nothing left to give to the person who mattered most. But even then, he didn't know what to do. How could he change? How could he stop being the fixer when it was all he knew? He didn't know where to begin or what it would look like to stop. All he knew was that the life he had been living, the life of helping others at the expense of his own happiness, was no longer sustainable. He had reached a breaking point, and though he couldn't see it yet, it was a turning point that would force him to confront the truth he had been avoiding for so long. The breaking point had arrived. The weight he had carried for so long had finally become unbearable. And though he didn't want to admit it, he knew deep down that something had to change. The life he had built, the one where he was always the one to fix others, had left him empty and exhausted. It wasn't a moment of clarity that hit him. Rather, it was a slow realization, a quiet voice in the back of his mind that had been growing louder over time. One evening, after another long and tiring day of helping a close friend through their personal crisis, he arrived home late. His partner was waiting for him, but this time there was no excitement in their eyes. No warm embrace or eager questions about his day. They simply sat in silence, and in that silence something shifted. It was as if everything came crashing down in an instant, and he finally saw the truth. His partner, who had been his rock, who had stood by him through everything, was now just as exhausted as he was. They had been patient for so long, but the years of his constant unavailability and emotional distance had taken their toll. For the first time he realized that it wasn't just him who had been struggling, it was both of them. And that realization hit him harder than any other. He wasn't alone in this. His actions had affected the person he loved most. His partner spoke gently, their voice filled with both concern and sorrow. "I don't know who you are anymore," they said. "You're not the person I fell in love with. You've become someone who is always giving to others but never to yourself. And I'm tired. I'm tired of waiting for you to come back." Those words stung. They weren't meant to hurt, but they did. And in that moment, he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He had been so focused on fixing everyone else's problems, on being the solution for others, that he had neglected the most important relationship in his life. His partner wasn't angry with him. They were simply tired. Tired of giving, tired of waiting, and most of all, tired of feeling invisible in the one relationship that was supposed to matter the most. For the first time, he truly heard them. He understood that he had pushed away everything that was important to him in his quest to fix the world, and now the person who had stood by his side through everything was standing on the edge, wondering if they could keep going. That night, as he lay in bed unable to sleep, he thought about all the times he had ignored his own needs. He had been so determined to help others that he had forgotten to help himself. The guilt of not being there for his partner weighed heavily on him. He had been blind to the damage he was doing, too focused on the idea of being the fixer to see that he was breaking down in the process. The next day, he took a step he never thought he would. He made an appointment with a therapist. It wasn't something he had ever considered before. He had always been the one to give advice to help others find solutions to their problems. But now it was his turn to seek help. He knew that if he didn't do something about his own struggles, he would lose everything that mattered to him. At first, the sessions were uncomfortable. He wasn't used to talking about his feelings. He wasn't used to confronting the fact that he had been running on empty for so long. But as time went on, he started to understand the root of his behavior. He had spent his life trying to fix others because it gave him a sense of purpose. It made him feel needed, important, and valued. But in doing so, he had ignored his own emotional health, his own needs, and his own desires. The more he opened up in therapy, the more he began to understand that his need to help others was not necessarily a bad thing, but it was all-consuming. It was a way of avoiding his own pain, his own fears, and his own insecurities. He had built walls around himself by focusing solely on others, because it was easier than facing the discomfort within. But now, he was starting to see that in order to truly help others, he needed to help himself first. He needed to rebuild the parts of himself that had been neglected for so long. He needed to learn how to set boundaries, how to say no, how to take care of his own emotional well-being before he could continue helping others in a healthy way. He began to make small changes. He started saying no to requests that drained him. He began taking time for himself, reading a book, going for a walk, spending time with his partner without distractions. It wasn't easy. The guilt was still there, the fear of disappointing others, but he knew that he was doing the right thing. Little by little, he began to feel like he was regaining control of his life. The process was slow, and there were setbacks along the way. There were days when the old patterns crept back in, when he felt the pressure to help others too much, to overextend himself. But each time he took a step back, remembered what he was learning in therapy, and reassessed. He didn't have to fix everything. He didn't have to be the solution to everyone's problems. And most importantly, he didn't have to lose himself in the process. As he worked through his own healing, his relationship with his partner began to improve. Slowly, trust was rebuilt. His partner noticed the change in him. He was more present, more engaged, more willing to listen, and for the first time in a long while, they were able to connect on a deeper level. The walls that had been built between them started to crumble, and they began to rediscover the bond that had brought them together in the first place. It wasn't perfect. Healing never is, but he was no longer the person who defined himself by the needs of others. He was learning to find balance, to care for himself while still being there for the people he loved. He had discovered that true healing didn't come from fixing everyone else. It came from fixing himself first. And though he still helped others, he did so with a new sense of purpose, a sense that he was in control of his own life, and not defined by the endless demands of the world around him. It was a journey, one that he knew would take time, but it was a journey he was finally ready to take. As the days passed, he found himself learning to live a life that was more balanced. It wasn't easy, and at times he found himself slipping back into old habits. The pull to help others, to fix things for everyone else, was a strong one. But with each day, he grew a little more comfortable with the idea of taking care of himself first. He learned that he didn't have to sacrifice his own well-being to make a difference in the lives of others. He continued with therapy, finding that it became a safe space where he could unpack the years of emotional exhaustion he had hidden from others. He learned how to set boundaries, how to say no without guilt, and how to recognize when he was giving too much of himself away. It wasn't that he didn't want to help. It was that he had to understand the importance of preserving his energy, both physically and emotionally. One of the most difficult lessons he learned was that helping others didn't always mean solving their problems. He had spent so many years thinking that he had to fix everything, that he had to be the one with all the answers. But in therapy, he came to realize that sometimes the best way to help someone was simply to listen, to offer support without trying to take on their burdens as his own. And so, he began to change how he interacted with others. Instead of rushing in with solutions, he learned to pause and ask the right questions. He became more patient, more present, and less focused on fixing everything. He realized that by allowing others to take responsibility for their own struggles, he was empowering them to grow and learn on their own. It was a humbling experience, but it also brought him a deep sense of peace. At home, things were starting to feel different as well. His partner, who had once felt distant and neglected, now felt heard and understood. There were still difficult moments, still times when the old patterns of overgiving crept back in, but they were becoming less frequent. His partner noticed the change in him, not just in the way he helped, but in the way he loved. He was more patient, more engaged, and more willing to share his own thoughts and feelings. They began to reconnect in ways they hadn't before. It wasn't just about learning how to help others. It was about learning how to be vulnerable, how to ask for help when he needed it, and how to let go of the need to be perfect. He didn't have to have all the answers. He didn't have to be everything to everyone. He was allowed to be imperfect, and in doing so he found strength. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, he came home to find his partner waiting for him. This time, instead of the silence that had once hung between them, there was a warmth. They didn't talk about anything deep or profound. They simply sat together, enjoying each other's presence. And for the first time in a long time, he realized that this was enough. It was enough to simply be together, without the weight of expectations or the pressure to fix anything. As he sat with his partner, he reflected on how far he had come. There were still challenges ahead, but he no longer felt lost. He had a sense of direction now, one that was grounded in self-care and balance. He understood that in order to be the best version of himself, he needed to take care of his own mental and emotional health first. There were still moments of doubt, times when he wondered if he was doing enough. But instead of rushing to fill those moments with action, he allowed himself to sit with the uncertainty. He learned to trust that he didn't have to fix everything. Some things were beyond his control, and that was okay. It was a slow journey, one that required patience and self-compassion. There were still days when he felt overwhelmed, when he questioned whether he was doing the right thing. But each day, he moved a little closer to the version of himself that he had always wanted to be, a version that wasn't defined by his need to fix others, but by his ability to be present, to listen, and to love without conditions. One of the most important lessons he learned was that healing wasn't a destination. It was a process. It was ongoing, filled with ups and downs, twists and turns, but it was a process he was willing to embrace. He no longer felt like he had to have it all figured out. He didn't need to be perfect. All he needed to do was show up, be kind to himself, and trust that the rest would fall into place. He began to find joy in the small things again. He started to rediscover hobbies and passions that had once brought him joy, but that he had abandoned in his quest to help others. He reconnected with old friends, not because they needed him, but because he genuinely enjoyed their company. He took time to explore new interests, to challenge himself in ways that had nothing to do with fixing anyone else. And with each new experience, he found more peace within himself. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but rather a series of small steps that added up over time. He didn't have to rush. He didn't have to be anyone other than who he was. And for the first time in a long time, he realized that he was enough just as he was. He no longer had to fix everything around him to feel important. He was important simply by existing, by showing up for himself and for the people he loved. And so, as he continued on this journey of self-discovery and healing, he found himself at peace. He had learned to let go of the need to be the solution for everyone else. He had learned that his worth wasn't defined by his ability to fix things. It was defined by his ability to love, to be present, and to care for himself. And that was enough. As he continued his journey of self-discovery, life started to feel less like a constant struggle and more like a series of small, meaningful moments. Each step he took, no matter how small, was a step toward healing. The weight of the world that he had once carried on his shoulders had begun to lift, and he realized that the world didn't need him to fix everything. It simply needed him to be himself. He learned to embrace imperfections, not just in others, but in himself. He had spent so many years thinking that being perfect was the only way to earn love and respect. But now he understood that it was through vulnerability, honesty, and self-compassion that he truly connected with others. His relationship with his partner had deepened in ways he had never imagined. They had begun to communicate openly about their needs, their desires, and their fears. There was no longer any room for unspoken resentment between them. His partner, who had once been weary of his constant emotional unavailability, now felt supported and cherished in a way they hadn't in years. They had started to rebuild their bond layer by layer. They spent evenings talking about everything and nothing, laughing about silly things and sharing quiet moments of comfort. The spark that had once seemed lost had returned, and for the first time in a long time, they both felt that sense of connection again. But it wasn't just his relationship with his partner that had changed. His approach to life in general was different now. He no longer felt like he had to be everything to everyone. He wasn't the savior or the problem solver anymore. Instead, he was someone who was willing to be present, to listen, and to offer help when it was needed, but without losing himself in the process. He began to take real breaks, to rest without guilt. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to enjoy a weekend without thinking about all the things he had to fix or people he needed to help. He spent time exploring hobbies that had once brought him joy, but had been forgotten over time. He rediscovered the simple pleasures of life, reading books, taking walks in the park, cooking meals for himself, and just sitting in the quiet moments. He found peace in the small acts of self-care that had once seemed insignificant. A quiet evening spent alone, a hot cup of coffee in the morning, a leisurely walk through the neighborhood. These things had become treasures he no longer took for granted. He had come to understand that these moments were the foundation of a life well lived, not the endless cycle of doing for others that he had once believed was necessary. There were still moments when he felt the familiar urge to help, to step in and solve the problems of the people around him, but now he could recognize that urge for what it was. It wasn't always a healthy desire to help. It was often a distraction, a way of avoiding his own discomfort. And with that awareness, he was able to choose when to act and when to step back. He no longer felt the pressure to be everything to everyone, and it was freeing. It wasn't always easy, though. There were days when old habits crept back in, when the weight of responsibility seemed too much to ignore. But instead of succumbing to that pressure, he reminded himself of the progress he had made. He had learned to listen to his body and mind, to recognize when he was stretched too thin and to take a step back before it became overwhelming. He no longer felt ashamed of needing time for himself. As he continued to grow, he began to understand that healing wasn't linear. Some days were better than others, and that was okay. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, but there was also progress. Each time he made a conscious decision to care for himself first, he felt stronger, more resilient, and more at peace. It wasn't about perfection. It was about learning to show up for himself day after day in the best way he could. He also began to realize that it was okay to ask for help when he needed it. For so many years, he had prided himself on being the one who fixed things for others, the one who had all the answers. But now he understood that it was okay to lean on others when the burden became too much to carry alone. He no longer had to be the one to have all the solutions. Sometimes the best thing he could do was to share his struggles and allow others to support him, just as he had supported so many before. This shift in perspective had a profound impact on his work as well. He had always been someone who took on every task, no matter how overwhelming. He was the problem solver, the fixer, but now he was able to recognize when he needed to delegate or ask for help. He learned that it wasn't a sign of weakness to admit that he couldn't do everything on his own. It was a sign of strength. And as he embraced this new approach, he found that his work became more manageable, more enjoyable, and more fulfilling. He began to set clearer boundaries with his colleagues and clients. Instead of always being available, he started to prioritize his own well-being and time. He didn't feel guilty for saying no when he needed to. And in doing so, he found that the quality of his work improved. He was more focused, more productive, and more creative. His sense of fulfillment at work grew, not because he was doing more, but because he was doing it in a way that honored his own needs. One day, as he reflected on how far he had come, he realized that the life he was living now was the life he had always wanted. He had let go of the need to fix everything, and in doing so, he had found freedom. He no longer defined himself by his ability to help others. Instead, he defined himself by his ability to show up for himself, to love and care for himself, and to be present for those who mattered most. He understood now that true happiness didn't come from being the solution to everyone else's problems. It came from being at peace with who he was, from living a life that was true to himself. And as he embraced this new way of being, he realized that he had finally found the balance he had been searching for all along. And so, his journey continued, not as the fixer of others' lives, but as someone who lived fully in his own. He wasn't perfect, and there would always be challenges ahead, but he was no longer afraid. He had found his strength in vulnerability, in self-care, and in the quiet moments that reminded him of the simple joys of life. In the end, he discovered that by healing himself, he had the ability to heal the world around him, not by fixing everything, but by being whole. And that, he realized, was enough.